In the autumn of 1973, David Rockefeller flew to Cairo to meet Anwar Sadat. Egypt and Israel had just fought the Yom Kippur War. The region was ablaze. American foreign policy was in crisis. The Arab oil embargo had begun, and the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank was conducting his own foreign policy, separate from, occasionally at odds with, and sometimes more effective than the official diplomacy of the United States government. He was not an elected official. He held no government appointment. He carried no diplomatic passport. He was a banker, the chairman of one of the largest commercial banks in the world, a man who had inherited one of the greatest fortunes in American history, and who had, over the preceding 2 decades, transformed that inheritance into something that the money alone could never have purchased, a position of genuine global influence that operated in the spaces between governments, between ideologies, between the official channels of Cold War diplomacy and the informal networks of private power. David Rockefeller met more heads of state over the course of his career than most American secretaries of state. He traveled to the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War and had substantive conversations with Soviet leaders that American diplomats were struggling to arrange. He opened China to American banking before the normalization of US-China relations made such contact politically uncontroversial. He negotiated directly with Arab leaders, Latin American presidents, African heads of state, and European prime ministers, not as a representative of the American government, but as himself, as the embodiment of a specific kind of private power that the second half of the 20th century had made possible, and that David Rockefeller had exploited more fully than anyone else of his generation. He founded the Trilateral Commission, the organization that became the most famous and most contested symbol of globalist elite coordination in the 20th century. Beloved by internationalists who saw it as a mechanism for building the cross-border cooperation that the post-war world required, despised by critics on both the left and the right, who saw it as evidence of exactly the kind of unaccountable private power that democratic governance was supposed to constrain. He ran Chase Manhattan Bank for 24 years, transforming it from a significant but domestically focused commercial bank into one of the first genuinely global banking institutions, a bank whose international operations in the 1970s and 1980s represented a model of commercial banking that the entire industry was attempting to replicate. He died in March 2017 at the age of 101, the last surviving grandchild of John D. Rockefeller, the man who had built Standard Oil and the fortune that made everything that followed possible. He had outlived the Cold War that had defined the middle decades of his career. He had outlived the era of American financial dominance that his bank had both embodied and advanced. He had outlived most of the world he had been so central in shaping. This is the story of David Rockefeller, the geopolitical banker, the private diplomat, the architect of the global elite's institutional infrastructure, and the man who, more than any other individual of his generation, embodied the specific and contestable proposition that private power, exercised responsibly and internationally, could be a constructive force in the governance of the world. Whether that proposition was true is one of the great contested questions of the 20th century. That David Rockefeller believed it and acted on it with extraordinary consistency across 6 decades of public life is beyond dispute. New York City, 1915. The Rockefeller family is the wealthiest family in American history, wealthier relative to the size of the American economy than any family before or since. John D. Rockefeller Sr., the patriarch, had built Standard Oil into the most powerful corporation in the United States and had accumulated a fortune estimated at the equivalent of $340 billion in modern terms, a sum so large that it exceeded the annual GDP of most countries and that dwarfed the wealth of any other individual in the world. The fortune had come at a cost that John D. Rockefeller was acutely aware of, a cost measured not in money, but in public trust. Standard Oil had been the target of muckraking journalism, congressional investigation, and ultimately the Supreme Court antitrust decision of 1911 that had broken the company into 34 separate entities. The Rockefeller name, by the early 20th century, was synonymous in American public discourse with the predatory capitalism of the Gilded Age, with monopoly power, with the ruthless elimination of competition, with the concentration of economic power in private hands on a scale that the American democratic tradition found deeply unsettling. John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s response to this reputational challenge was philanthropy on a scale that matched the scale of the fortune, the founding of the University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, the General Education Board, and ultimately the Rockefeller Foundation, which became the largest philanthropic organization in the world. The philanthropy served multiple purposes: genuine charitable intent, the channeling of the fortune into socially beneficial uses, and the systematic reconstruction of the Rockefeller family's public image from the symbol of predatory capitalism into something more complicated and more defensible. David Rockefeller was born on June 12, 1915, the youngest of 6 children of John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. He grew up in a family that was acutely conscious of both its extraordinary privilege and the public responsibility that the family's history and its continuing wealth imposed. The 6th floor of 2006 Broadway, where John D. Rockefeller Jr. managed the family's philanthropic and investment activities, was the physical expression of this consciousness, a place of serious purpose, of long-term thinking, of the belief that great wealth carried great obligations. David was educated at the Lincoln School, a progressive private school associated with Teachers College at Columbia University that took a deliberately experimental approach to education. He subsequently attended Harvard, where he studied economics and where the combination of his family background and his own intellectual seriousness gave him access to a range of people and ideas that shaped his thinking in ways that would persist throughout his career. The Harvard education was followed by graduate study at the London School of Economics and then at the University of Chicago, where he completed a doctorate in economics. In 1940, the doctorate was significant, not because the academic credential was commercially necessary for someone of David Rockefeller's family connections, but because it reflected a genuine intellectual seriousness and a commitment to understanding the world through systematic analysis, rather than through the intuition and relationship management that characterized most of the banking world he was about to enter. He served in the army during the Second World War, seeing action in North Africa and France, and earning a decoration for his service. The military experience was, by David Rockefeller's own later account, one of the formative experiences of his life, not because of the combat, but because of the exposure to a world far removed from the Rockefeller family's social universe, to people whose lives were entirely different from his own, and to the specific realities of a world at war that no amount of academic study could adequately prepare a person for. He joined Chase National Bank in 1946, the year after the war ended. The bank would eventually merge with the Bank of the Manhattan Company to become Chase Manhattan Bank in 1955. And it was as the chairman of Chase Manhattan that David Rockefeller would build the career that made him one of the most consequential private figures of the 20th century. But before the career can be understood, the inheritance needs to be understood, not the financial inheritance, which was distributed across 6 siblings and managed through the complex family financial structures that John D. Rockefeller Jr. had established, but the inheritance of expectation, of public responsibility, and of the specific Rockefeller belief that private wealth, properly directed, was a legitimate and even necessary instrument of the common good. The Rockefeller family's approach to its own wealth and power in the mid-20th century was, by the standards of American plutocracy, unusual in its self-consciousness and its institutionalization. The family did not simply have money, it had a philosophy about money, a set of beliefs about what wealth was for and how it should be used, that had been developed and refined across 3 generations by the time David Rockefeller came of age. At the center of this philosophy was the conviction that wealth at the Rockefeller scale was not simply a private asset, but a quasi-public trust, that the family had, by virtue of its fortune, both the capacity and the obligation to contribute to the improvement of the world in ways that went beyond the normal obligations of private citizenship. This conviction was not merely rhetorical, it was expressed in the founding of institutions, the Rockefeller Foundation, the General Education Board, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, that channeled enormous resources into education, medicine, scientific research, and the arts, in ways that shaped American and global civilization in lasting and tangible ways. The Rockefeller family's philanthropic and institutional activities were managed from room 5,600 in 30 Rockefeller Plaza, the family office that coordinated the investments, the philanthropies, and the broader public activities of what was, in the mid-20th century, effectively a private government. Room 5600 employed dozens of professional staff. It managed relationships with the boards of universities, museums, hospitals, research institutes, and policy organizations across the country. It coordinated the family members' public activities, their board memberships, their charitable commitments, their political relationships, with a degree of professional management that most actual governments would have envied. David Rockefeller grew up in this environment of organized purposefulness, and it shaped his approach to his own career in ways that were both enabling and constraining. It was enabling because it gave him a model for how private wealth could be deployed in service of public purposes, a model that he would apply, with modifications appropriate to the specific context of commercial banking, throughout his professional life. It was constraining because the expectations that the family philosophy imposed were genuine and demanding. Expectations of public service, of serious engagement with the great problems of the time, and of behavior consistent with the image of responsible stewardship that the family had spent decades constructing. The specific burden of the Rockefeller name, the baggage of Standard Oil, of the antitrust decision, of the public image of predatory capitalism that John D. Rockefeller Sr. had spent the latter part of his life attempting to overcome, was something that David and his generation had to navigate in their own ways. The burden was different for David than for his siblings. He had chosen a career in commercial banking, which placed him in the world of finance more directly than any of his brothers, except Nelson, who chose politics. A Rockefeller in banking raised questions about the relationship between the family's financial interests and the bank's decisions, about whether the chairman of Chase Manhattan was acting as a banker or as a steward of family interests. That required constant management. David's approach to this management was characteristic of the intellectual seriousness he had developed at Harvard and Chicago. He was genuinely careful about the boundaries between his family role and his banking role, maintaining a separation that was imperfect but genuine. And he was consistently transparent, by the standards of the era, about the family's relationships with the bank and with the various other institutions in which the family had interests. The five Rockefeller brothers, John III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David, were in aggregate one of the most significant forces in American public life in the middle decades of the 20th century. John III led the Rockefeller Foundation and the family's major philanthropic activities. Nelson became governor of New York and eventually vice president of the United States. Lawrence focused on venture capital and conservation. Winthrop went to Arkansas and became governor. And David chose banking and the international dimensions of the family's engagement with the world. The division of roles was not entirely accidental. The brothers had, through their upbringing and their father's explicit guidance, developed complementary rather than competing areas of engagement, each staking out a domain in which they could apply the family's resources and the family's name in pursuit of the public purposes that the family philosophy demanded. David's domain was the intersection of international finance and global affairs, the specific territory where the resources and relationships of a major commercial bank could be deployed in service of the kind of international engagement that the family's worldview valued. He was, in this sense, the most global of the Rockefeller brothers, the one whose career was most explicitly oriented toward the building of international relationships, toward the cultivation of a global network of personal connections and institutional partnerships, and toward the deployment of private financial power in the service of the international order that the family believed was essential to peace and prosperity. This orientation shaped every significant decision of his career, from the internationalization of Chase Manhattan to the founding of the Trilateral Commission to the specific diplomatic initiatives that made him the most traveled and most politically connected private banker in the world. David Rockefeller joined Chase National Bank in 1946 as an assistant manager in the foreign department, an entry-level position that was, given his family connections and his doctoral degree in economics, somewhat below the level that his credentials might have justified, but that reflected a deliberate choice to learn the business from the ground up, rather than to arrive as a Rockefeller heir, expecting deference. The foreign department was the right place for someone with David Rockefeller's specific interests and ambitions. The post-war world was being reconstituted commercially as well as politically. The Bretton Woods system, the Marshall Plan, the reconstruction of European economies, the development of new international financial institutions, and the commercial banks that served international trade and investment were at the center of this reconstitution. A banker who understood international finance was positioned to participate in the most consequential commercial developments of the era. David moved through the bank steadily, demonstrating the specific combination of intellectual ability, relationship management, and institutional judgment that distinguished the best commercial bankers from those who were merely technically competent. He became vice chairman in 1957 and president in 1969, a position he held until his retirement in 1981. The Chase Manhattan that David inherited as chairman in 1969 was a significant but domestically focused institution, one of the largest American commercial banks by assets, with a substantial corporate lending business and a growing international presence, but still primarily oriented toward the domestic American market and toward the large corporate clients that had been its franchise since the Rockefeller family's association with the bank in the early 20th century. David's strategic vision for Chase Manhattan was explicitly global. He believed, and the belief was shaped by both his economic training and his family's internationalist philosophy, that the future of commercial banking lay in the international arena, that the growing interconnection of the world economy was creating opportunities for banks that could serve clients across national boundaries in ways that domestically focused institutions could not. This was not a widely shared view among American commercial bankers in the late 1960s, most of whom regarded international banking as a supplement to rather than a replacement for the domestic franchise. The international expansion of Chase Manhattan under David's leadership was both strategic and personal. It was strategic in the sense that it reflected a deliberate assessment of where the commercial opportunities lay and a systematic program of building the branch network, the correspondent relationships, and the product capabilities that a genuinely global bank required. It was personal in the sense that David used his own network of relationships, the personal connections to heads of state, finance ministers, central bankers, and business leaders that he had been building since the late 1940s, as instruments of business development in ways that no banker without his specific background could have replicated. The personal diplomacy was, in practice, inseparable from the commercial strategy. When David visited Egypt and met with Sadat, he was simultaneously engaged in diplomatic activity, exploring the possibilities for a more constructive relationship between the United States and Egypt, at a time when official relations were strained, and in commercial activity, assessing the banking opportunities in a country that was beginning to open its economy to foreign investment. The two dimensions were not in tension, they were complementary, and the specific value that David provided to Chase Manhattan was precisely this complementarity, his ability to open doors that a purely commercial banking approach could not have opened. The internationalization of Chase Manhattan was not without its difficulties. The management of a genuinely global bank, with operations in dozens of countries serving clients across the full spectrum of the global economy. Navigating the regulatory environments of multiple jurisdictions was a significantly more complex management challenge than the management of a domestically focused institution. David was, by the assessment of many who worked closely with him, a better strategist and relationship manager than an operational manager, more comfortable in the C-suite of a major client than in the detailed management of a complex global banking operation. This created tensions within Chase Manhattan that contributed to the bank's mixed operational performance during his tenure. The bank's international expansion was commercially successful in generating revenue and building relationships. It was less consistently successful in managing the credit risks associated with lending to sovereign and corporate borrowers in markets where the regulatory environment, the information quality, and the institutional infrastructure were significantly different from what American banks were accustomed to. The sovereign debt crisis of the early 1980s, which emerged in Latin America and affected virtually all the major American banks with international operations, hit Chase Manhattan with particular force and raised questions about whether the bank's international ambitions had outrun its credit risk management capabilities. The operational tensions were real, and they contributed to the circumstances of David's retirement from Chase Manhattan in 1981. A retirement that came at a point when the bank's operational performance was under pressure and when the board had concluded that a more operationally focused leadership was required. David's departure was graceful. He remained a figure of enormous prestige and continued to be active through his other institutional roles, but it reflected a genuine assessment that the specific capabilities the bank needed at that moment in its history were not the capabilities that had made his tenure significant. The legacy of his 24 years at Chase Manhattan was nonetheless genuine and enduring. He had transformed a domestically focused commercial bank into a genuinely international institution, one of the first American banks to build a truly global presence. He had used the bank's international platform to develop the diplomatic and institutional relationships that made him one of the most influential private figures in global affairs. And he had demonstrated, through the specific combination of commercial banking and personal diplomacy that characterized his approach, that the boundaries between banking and foreign policy were not as fixed as the official architecture of international relations assumed. In 1964, David Rockefeller became the first American banker to visit the Soviet Union since the early years of the Cold War, meeting with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and with the heads of the Soviet banking and trade institutions, in a series of conversations that had no official American government sanction, but that were conducted with the knowledge and the tacit approval of the American foreign policy establishment. The visit was a deliberate exercise in private diplomacy, an attempt to explore whether the commercial and financial relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union could be developed beyond the minimal level that the Cold War's ideological hostility had reduced it to. David's argument, which he had been developing in his own thinking since the early 1960s, was that the expansion of commercial ties between the superpowers, the development of trade relationships, investment flows, and financial connections could serve as a stabilizing force in the overall relationship, creating mutual interests in the continuation of peaceful coexistence that the ideological conflict alone could not provide. The argument was not original to David Rockefeller. It was a version of the liberal internationalist argument for commercial engagement as a peace-building mechanism that had been made in various forms since the 19th century. But David had the specific credentials, the Rockefeller name, the Chase Manhattan chairmanship, the existing network of relationships with Soviet and Eastern European trade officials, to make the argument in Moscow in a way that few other Americans could have. And he had the personal confidence to make it at a moment when official American policy was deeply skeptical of any commercial engagement with the Soviet Union. The Moscow conversations were substantive. David discussed the possibility of Chase Manhattan establishing a correspondent banking relationship with Soviet banking institutions, a relationship that would facilitate the small but growing volume of US-Soviet trade, and that would create, at the level of financial institutions, a practical interest in the maintenance of workable relations between the two countries. He also explored the broader question of how American commercial banks might participate in the financing of Soviet trade and industrial development, a question that the Soviets were genuinely interested in, given their ongoing need for Western technology and capital equipment. The visit did not produce immediate commercial results. The political environment on both sides was too hostile for the kind of substantial banking relationship that David was exploring to be politically feasible in 1964. But it established David Rockefeller as someone the Soviet leadership was willing to deal with, a channel of communication between the American private sector and the Soviet government that would be used in subsequent years as the overall relationship between the superpowers evolved. The Soviet engagement was part of a broader pattern of private diplomatic initiatives that David pursued throughout the 1960s and 1970s, a pattern that took him to China before normalization, to Cuba in conversations with officials of the Castro government, to various Arab states at moments when official American relations were strained, and to a range of other politically sensitive destinations, where his private status gave him access and flexibility that official American diplomats did not have. The China engagement was particularly significant. David visited China in 1973, the year after Nixon's historic visit had opened the door to US-China normalization, and had conversations with Chinese economic officials about the possibilities for financial engagement between American banks and the Chinese economy. At this point, formal diplomatic recognition between the United States and China had not yet been established. That would not come until 1979, and the commercial banking relationship between the two countries was essentially non-existent. David's 1973 China visit was therefore genuinely pioneering, an attempt to develop the commercial dimensions of the US-China relationship at a moment when the political framework for that relationship was only beginning to be constructed. He met with Chinese officials, including Qiao Guanhua, the Chinese foreign minister, and discussed the possibilities for Chase Manhattan's involvement in financing Chinese trade and development. The conversations were exploratory. The Chinese economy of 1973 was not yet open to the kind of foreign banking participation that David was envisioning. But they established relationships and a mutual understanding that would prove valuable when the Chinese economic opening of the late 1970s and 1980s created real commercial opportunities. The pattern of private diplomacy that David Rockefeller developed across these years reflected a specific theory about how American interests were best served in the Cold War world, a theory that emphasized engagement over confrontation, commercial relationship building over ideological competition, and the development of mutual interests as the most reliable foundation for stable international relationships. This theory was not universally accepted within the American foreign policy establishment. It was regarded by many on the right as dangerously naive about the nature of the Soviet and Chinese systems, and by some on the left as an instrument for extending American corporate power under the guise of peaceful engagement. David was aware of both critiques and took them seriously as intellectual challenges, if not as reasons to change his approach. His response to the right-wing critique was that engagement was not appeasement, that developing commercial relationships with adversary governments did not imply endorsement of their political systems, and that the alternative of total commercial isolation had not demonstrably served American interests or hastened the reform of those systems. His response to the left-wing critique was more difficult because the critique that private banking engagement extended American corporate power was in some respects simply true. The development of Chase Manhattan's international operations did extend American financial power into new markets, and that extension served both the bank's commercial interests and the broader interests of American capitalism. The honest account of David Rockefeller's private diplomacy is that it served multiple purposes simultaneously, that it was genuinely oriented toward the building of more stable international relationships, genuinely motivated by a belief in the constructive role of commercial engagement, and genuinely useful to American foreign policy interests, while also serving the commercial interests of Chase Manhattan and the broader interests of the American financial and corporate establishment that David both represented and led. In 1973, David Rockefeller founded the Trilateral Commission, the organization that would become, in the following decades, both the most influential and the most controversial expression of the internationalist vision that had animated his career since the late 1940s. The specific intellectual origins of the Trilateral Commission lay in David's collaboration with Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Polish-American political scientist who would later serve as National Security Advisor to President Carter. Brzezinski had developed, in the early 1970s, a thesis about the changing character of international relations, about the way in which the growing economic interdependence of the industrialized democracies was creating the need for new forms of institutional coordination, that the existing international architecture, designed primarily for the management of state-to-state relations in a world of sovereign nation-states, was inadequate to provide. The specific gap that Brzezinski identified was between the trilateral regions, North America, Western Europe, and Japan, whose economic integration was advancing rapidly through trade, investment, and financial flows, but whose political and institutional coordination remained underdeveloped relative to the scale of their economic interdependence. The major international institutions, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, were designed for a world in which the United States was the dominant power and in which the other industrialized democracies were essentially junior partners. By the early 1970s, this architecture was increasingly inadequate to the reality of a world in which Western Europe had recovered from the war and Japan had become an economic powerhouse of the first order. David found Brzezinski's thesis compelling, and he saw in it the intellectual foundation for an institution that would address the gap, an organization that would bring together senior private sector figures, political leaders, academics, and civil society representatives from North America, Western Europe, and Japan to discuss the common challenges facing the industrialized democracies and to develop common approaches to addressing them. The organization would not be a formal international institution. It would have no legal status, no official mandate, and no governmental authority. It would be a forum for informal coordination, for the development of common perspectives, and for the cultivation of the personal relationships between decision-makers across the three regions that would facilitate the translation of common perspectives into common action. The founding of the Trilateral Commission in 1973 reflected both the intellectual vision and the practical networks that David had been building across 25 years of international banking and private diplomacy. The founding members included former presidents and prime ministers, senior corporate executives, prominent academics, and significant figures in civil society from all three trilateral regions. David's personal relationships, the network of connections he had built through Chase Manhattan's international operations, through his private diplomatic initiatives, and through his involvement in the various international policy organizations that constituted the infrastructure of elite globalism, made it possible to assemble a founding membership of genuine quality and genuine influence. The Trilateral Commission's work in the 1970s produced a series of reports on major international challenges, on the energy crisis, on international monetary reform, on North-South relations, on the governance of the global economy, that were influential in the policy discussions of the era. The organization's most famous, or notorious depending on one's perspective, early publication was a 1975 report titled The Crisis of Democracy, authored by Samuel Huntington, Michel Crozier, and Joji Watanuki, which argued that the industrialized democracies were facing a crisis of governability, that the expansion of democratic participation and the growth of demands on government had outrun the capacity of democratic institutions to deliver effective governance. The Crisis of Democracy report became a touchstone in the debate about the Trilateral Commission's political orientation. Its suggestion that democracy had in some respects produced in excess of demands on government, that the very success of democratic participation was creating governance problems that required institutional responses, was interpreted by critics on the left as evidence that the Trilateral Commission represented an elite backlash against the democratic gains of the 1960s. The organization, in this reading, was not a forum for addressing the common challenges of the industrialized democracies, but a mechanism for coordinating elite resistance to the expansion of popular participation in governance. The critique was not entirely without foundation. The Trilateral Commission was, by its nature and its membership, an elite organization composed of people who had reached positions of power and influence within the existing institutional order, and who were, almost by definition, more invested in the continuation of that order than in its radical transformation. The vision of international governance that the organization embodied was a vision of managed interdependence, of the coordination of national policies through elite networks of like-minded decision-makers, that was more comfortable with hierarchy and expertise than with radical democratization. David Rockefeller's own perspective on this critique was characteristically direct and characteristically untroubled by it. He believed that effective governance, at both the national and the international level, required the involvement of people with genuine expertise and genuine institutional experience. He did not believe that expertise and democratic legitimacy were in fundamental conflict, but he was also, honestly, more interested in the effectiveness of governance than in its representativeness. This was a genuine value difference, not a contradiction, and it helps explain both the Trilateral Commission's genuine policy influence and the genuine democratic objections to the kind of private elite coordination that the organization represented. The organization's influence on the Carter administration was particularly significant and particularly controversial. Several Trilateral Commission members, including Brzezinski himself, Cyrus Vance, who became Secretary of State, Harold Brown, who became Secretary of Defense, and Carter himself, joined the administration, creating the impression that the Trilateral Commission had effectively pre-selected the senior leadership of the US government. The impression was exaggerated. The Carter administration was shaped by many factors beyond the Trilateral Commission, but it was not entirely without basis. The Trilateral Commission continues to operate today in a form that has evolved significantly from the original 1970s organization. Its membership has expanded geographically, its policy work has evolved to address new challenges, and its relationship to power has changed as the world it was designed to address has been transformed by the end of the Cold War, the rise of China, and the various crises of the globalized order that the original members had hoped to build. whether its existence represents a legitimate form of private sector contribution to global governance, or an unaccountable form of elite coordination that poses a genuine challenge to democratic legitimacy, remains a genuinely contested question. In the autumn of 1979, Jimmy Carter received a phone call from David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger urging him to admit the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had been deposed by the Islamic Revolution in January of that year, into the United States for medical treatment. The Shah was seriously ill with lymphoma. David and Kissinger argued that humanitarian considerations, combined with the long history of American support for the Shah's government, required that the United States provide him with asylum and treatment. Carter was reluctant. His advisors had warned him that admitting the Shah would provoke exactly the kind of anti-American reaction in Iran that the new revolutionary government was seeking opportunities to manufacture. The American embassy in Tehran was operating in a precarious environment. The diplomats there were effectively hostages to the goodwill of a government that regarded the United States as the principal sponsor of the regime it had just overthrown. David Rockefeller's intervention on the Shah's behalf was not primarily humanitarian, though the humanitarian dimension was genuine. It was also commercial. Chase Manhattan Bank had been the Shah's government's primary American banking relationship, the bank that managed the Iranian government's dollar accounts, that financed Iranian trade, and that had participated extensively in the development lending that was financing the Shah's ambitious modernization program. The bank had billions of dollars in loans and deposits connected to the Iranian government and to Iranian commercial entities. And the collapse of the Shah's government and the advent of a revolutionary Islamic republic that was implacably hostile to American interests created immediate and serious commercial questions for the bank. David's intervention with Carter reflected the specific character of the relationship between Chase Manhattan and the Shah's government, a relationship that had been built over decades of David's personal cultivation of the Iranian connection, beginning in the 1950s when the Shah was consolidating his power with American backing. He had visited Iran multiple times, maintained a personal relationship with the Shah, and overseen the development of Chase Manhattan's Iranian business into one of the bank's most significant international relationships. The connection was both personal and commercial, and when the Shah was deposed, the two dimensions were impossible to separate. Carter admitted the Shah in October 1979. Within 2 weeks, Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took the diplomats hostage. The hostage crisis lasted 444 days, dominated Carter's presidency, contributed substantially to his electoral defeat in 1980, and transformed the relationship between the United States and Iran in ways that still shape the world today. David Rockefeller was not responsible for the Iranian Revolution or for the hostage crisis. Events of that magnitude have causes that go well beyond any individual's decisions. But his role in the specific decision to admit the Shah was real, and it was a decision that had catastrophic consequences for the Carter presidency and for American foreign policy. The connection between David's private commercial and diplomatic interests and the official foreign policy decision that he helped shape was, in this case, genuinely problematic. A case in which the interests of Chase Manhattan and the interests of the United States were not as perfectly aligned as David's private diplomacy generally assumed them to be. The Iranian crisis also had direct commercial consequences for Chase Manhattan. The revolutionary government's decision to default on its debts to American banks and the American government's decision to freeze Iranian assets in American banks in retaliation created a complex legal and financial situation that took years to resolve. The bank's Iranian exposure was significant, and the resolution of the frozen assets question through the Algiers Accords of 1981, the agreement that secured the release of the hostages in exchange for the unfreezing of Iranian assets and the settlement of claims, was one of the most complex financial legal settlements ever undertaken. The Iranian episode illustrated a tension that ran through David Rockefeller's entire career. The tension between his genuine belief in the constructive role of private diplomacy and commercial engagement in international affairs, and the reality that private interests and public interests did not always align in the ways that his internationalist philosophy assumed. When they aligned, as they often did, his private diplomacy was genuinely useful to American foreign policy and genuinely beneficial to the stability of international relations. When they diverged, as they did in the Iranian case, the consequences could be severe. David, drew different conclusions from the Iranian experience than his critics drew. Where his critics saw evidence that private banking interests should not be allowed to shape foreign policy decisions, David saw evidence that the relationship between commercial engagement and political stability was genuinely complex, that the development of deep commercial relationships with political systems that were themselves unstable created exposures that neither private banking nor official foreign policy could fully manage. This was a more honest conclusion than either a simple defense of his conduct or a simple acceptance of his critics' framing. And it reflected the intellectual seriousness that distinguished David's engagement with his own record from the defensive self-justification that less self-aware individuals might have offered. To understand David Rockefeller's full impact on the world, you have to look beyond Chase Manhattan and beyond the Trilateral Commission to the broader institutional architecture that he helped build and sustain across 5 decades of organizational engagement. The list of organizations with which he was significantly involved reads like a comprehensive catalog of the elite institutional infrastructure of American and global governance in the second half of the 20th century. The Council on Foreign Relations, the preeminent American foreign policy think tank, which he joined in the late 1940s and which he eventually served as chairman, was perhaps the most important of these institutional involvements. The Council had been founded in 1921 as a mechanism for bringing together senior officials, academics, business leaders, and foreign policy practitioners to discuss American foreign policy outside the constraints of official government channels. By the time David became deeply involved in the 1950s and 1960s, it had evolved into the central institution of the American foreign policy establishment, the organization through which the consensus views of the foreign policy community were developed, tested, and communicated to government. David's involvement with the Council was not merely nominal. He was a genuine participant in its intellectual life, attending meetings, engaging with the debates, and contributing his own perspectives shaped by his banking experience and his personal diplomatic activities. He also contributed financially and organizationally, helping the Council develop the resources and the institutional capacity to sustain its role as the central forum of American foreign policy debate. The Bilderberg Group was another significant institutional involvement. The Bilderberg meetings, annual gatherings of senior political, business, and intellectual figures from Western Europe and North America, were founded in 1954 at the initiative of Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands as a mechanism for building transatlantic solidarity at a moment when the relationship between the United States and Western Europe was under strain. David participated regularly in the Bilderberg meetings from their early years, and his participation reflected both his genuine commitment to transatlantic solidarity and his specific interest in the institutional mechanisms that could sustain it. The Museum of Modern Art was a very different kind of institutional involvement, one that reflected the family's deep engagement with the arts and culture that had been part of the Rockefeller tradition since John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s patronage of Rockefeller Center and the revival of colonial Williamsburg. David served as chairman of MoMA's board for many years, and his involvement with the museum was a genuine personal passion rather than simply an obligation of the family tradition. His interest in modern art was real, and his engagement with MoMA contributed to the museum's development into one of the most significant cultural institutions in the world. The involvement with arts institutions like MoMA was also, in ways that David was quite explicit about, connected to his broader internationalist agenda. Cultural diplomacy, the promotion of American culture, and in particular American modern art, as an expression of the values of a free and creative society, was a significant dimension of American soft power during the Cold War, and the institutional development of American cultural institutions was part of the broader project of constructing the infrastructure of American global influence that David's career embodied. David's engagement with development economics and international development organizations reflected another dimension of the family's internationalist philosophy, the belief that the gap between the wealthy industrialized countries and the developing world was both a moral problem and a practical threat to international stability. He was involved with the International Executive Service Corps, an organization that sent retired American business executives to provide management consulting to businesses in developing countries. He supported the development activities of the Rockefeller Foundation, which had a long history of investment in agricultural development, public health, and educational institution building in the developing world. and he engaged personally with the development challenges of specific countries and regions through his banking activities and his private diplomatic initiatives. The Chase Manhattan Development Bank activities, the programs through which the bank provided financing for development projects in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, were not primarily philanthropic, but they reflected David's belief that commercial banking could serve development purposes as well as commercial ones, and that the development of viable banking and financial systems in the developing world was both commercially interesting for the bank and broadly beneficial for the countries concerned. Looking at the full range of David Rockefeller's institutional involvements, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, MoMA, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Chase Manhattan's international development activities, and dozens of other organizations and initiatives that he supported over 5 decades, what emerges is a picture of extraordinary institutional ambition, not the ambition of an individual seeking personal power or personal enrichment. David Rockefeller was never going to become richer or more prestigious than he already was, but the ambition of someone who genuinely believed that the construction of institutional infrastructure, of organizations, forums, networks, and mechanisms for coordination was the most reliable path to the international order that he was convinced the world needed. Whether that conviction was right is a question that the history of the institutions he helped build does not resolve cleanly. Some of the institutional infrastructure he invested in, the Council on Foreign Relations, the major international financial institutions, has genuinely contributed to the management of international challenges in ways that the world is better for. Some, the Trilateral Commission with its ambiguous legacy of policy influence and democratic unaccountability, has produced outcomes that are more contested, and some, the private banking relationships with politically connected governments that form the commercial core of his career, has, as the Iranian case illustrated, sometimes served American interests and sometimes complicated them. No account of David Rockefeller's life and legacy can ignore the conspiracy theories, the claims about his role in a global shadow government, the allegations that the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations were vehicles for the imposition of a new world order, the specific assertions about the Rockefeller family's alleged control of global finance, media, and government that have circulated in various forms since the 1970s and that have multiplied dramatically in the Internet era. These theories deserve engagement, not because they are true, but because the specific reasons they are not true illuminate something important about what David Rockefeller actually was and what he actually did. The conspiracy theories make claims about private power that are, in some respects, more interesting than the conspiracy theories proponents understand, and the honest response to them requires distinguishing between what is false and what is simply more complicated than the conspiracy frame allows. The core claim of the most common conspiracy theories about David Rockefeller is that he was the leader, or one of the leaders, of a group of global elites who secretly controlled the major governments of the world, manipulating political events, financial systems, and media coverage in order to advance a specific agenda for global governance that democratic populations would not have endorsed if presented with it openly. The Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations figure prominently in these theories as the organizational vehicles through which this secret coordination was achieved. The claim is false in its specific assertions, but points towards something real in its general direction. David Rockefeller was not a secret ruler of the world. The Trilateral Commission did not secretly control the governments of its member countries. The decisions of the Carter administration, of the Reagan administration, of the various European governments that Trilateral Commission members served in were not secretly determined by David Rockefeller in consultation with other trilateral members. What is true, and what the conspiracy theories capture in distorted form, is that David Rockefeller was a man of extraordinary private influence who used that influence through institutional networks and personal relationships to shape the environment in which official policy decisions were made. He was not a secret ruler. He was something more interesting and more complicated, a private citizen whose network of personal relationships with the actual rulers of the world gave him access and influence that was real, substantial, and not fully transparent to democratic processes. The Trilateral Commission was not a secret organization. Its membership was published, its reports were public, its meetings were not conducted in secrecy. But it was an organization that operated in the specific space between the public and the private, that characterizes elite institutional life, where access depends on membership, where the frank exchange of views depends on the assurance that specific statements will not be attributed publicly, and where the influence on policy operates through the informal channels of personal relationship rather than through the formal channels of democratic accountability. David Rockefeller, in his own memoir published in 2002, acknowledged his private influence with a directness that his defenders sometimes found inconvenient. He wrote, in a passage that has been extensively quoted, about his involvement in building what he called a more integrated global political and economic structure, a world government, in the language of his critics, even if David himself did not use that term. He acknowledged that he was proud of this work and that he would continue to pursue it. The passage is worth taking seriously because it reveals something about David Rockefeller's worldview that neither his hagiographers nor his conspiracy theory critics fully capture. He genuinely believed that the construction of a more integrated global order, through institutions, through commercial relationships, through the cultivation of personal networks among decision-makers, was necessary and beneficial. He believed this not secretly, but openly, as a conviction that he was willing to defend in public. And he was, as the passage acknowledges, not a disinterested observer of this process, but an active participant in it, someone who was using his private resources and his personal influence to advance a specific vision of international order. The legitimate critique of David Rockefeller is not that he was secretly controlling the world. He wasn't. The legitimate critique is that the specific form of private influence he exercised, the coordination of elite networks, the private diplomacy, the institutional infrastructure building, operated largely outside the formal structures of democratic accountability, and that the specific interests and values that shaped his vision of international order were not representative of the full range of human interests and values that a genuinely democratic global governance would need to incorporate. He was a man of his class, the American WASP elite of the mid-20th century, in ways that shaped his vision of the good international order, in specific and sometimes limiting ways. His internationalism was genuinely sincere, but it was an internationalism that prioritized the stability and smooth functioning of the capitalist international order over the claims of those whose interests were not well served by that order. His private diplomacy was genuinely useful to American foreign policy in many contexts, but it was private diplomacy conducted by someone whose personal commercial interests were themselves a significant factor in the foreign policy environment he was seeking to shape. The honest assessment of David Rockefeller acknowledges both the genuine contribution, the building of international institutional infrastructure, the maintenance of channels of communication across the Cold War divide, the demonstration that private diplomacy could play a constructive role in international affairs, and the genuine limitations, the democratic deficit of elite coordination, the occasional alignment of private banking interests with foreign policy decisions that served Chase Manhattan better than they served the American public, and the specific class and ideological character of the internationalist vision that he so consistently and so energetically advanced. David Rockefeller died on March 20, 2017, at his home in Pocantico Hills, New York. He was 101 years old. His death came in a political moment that seemed, in some respects, designed to illustrate the distance between the world he had spent his life building and the world that actually existed in the second decade of the 21st century. Donald Trump had been inaugurated as President of the United States 2 months earlier on a platform that was explicitly hostile to the kind of internationalism, the multilateral institutions, the free trade agreements, the elite networks that David Rockefeller had devoted his career to building. The Brexit vote in Britain had occurred the previous year. The nationalist and populist movements that were reshaping politics across the industrialized democracies were, in almost every case, direct reactions against the specific vision of managed globalization that the Trilateral Commission had been designed to advance and that David Rockefeller's career had embodied. The timing was not merely coincidental. The political backlash against globalization that produced Trump and Brexit was, in significant part, a backlash against the specific outcomes that the internationalist project had produced, outcomes that had been good for the globally mobile, the highly educated, and the financially sophisticated, and less good for the people whose jobs had been displaced by trade liberalization, whose communities had been hollowed out by the movement of capital toward lower-cost locations, and whose voices had been systematically underrepresented in the elite networks and institutions through which the global order had been constructed and managed. David Rockefeller was not responsible for these outcomes in any simple causal sense. The forces that produced the 2016 political backlash were too complex, too various, and too deeply rooted in structural economic changes to be attributed to any individual or any organization. But he was a significant contributor to the construction of the specific version of globalization, whose discontents produced the backlash, a version that prioritized economic integration, elite coordination, and the smooth functioning of the capitalist international system over the concerns of those who were not its beneficiaries. The honest assessment of his legacy, therefore, requires holding two things simultaneously: the genuine achievements of the internationalist project that he was so central in building, and the genuine failures of that project to produce the broadly shared prosperity and the broadly inclusive governance that its architects had, in their more optimistic moments, hoped it would deliver. The genuine achievements are real and substantial. The institutional infrastructure of the post-war international order, the multilateral financial institutions, the international trade system, the networks of diplomatic and commercial relationship across the Cold War divide, contributed to the longest period of major power peace in modern history. The development of commercial relationships across ideological lines, with the Soviet Union, with China, with various developing world governments, helped create the mutual interests that gave both the Cold War and its eventual peaceful resolution a more manageable character than the ideological hostility of the early Cold War decades had suggested was possible. The cultivation of cross-border elite networks, whatever their democratic deficits, facilitated the coordination of policy responses to shared challenges in ways that made those responses more coherent than they would otherwise have been. The genuine failures are equally real. The globalization that the Trilateral Commission and the broader elite institutional infrastructure helped to manage did not produce the broadly shared prosperity that its advocates had promised. The democratic deficit of elite coordination, the fact that the most consequential decisions about the shape of the international order were made in forums like the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations, rather than through the messy, slow, but ultimately more legitimate processes of democratic deliberation, contributed to the erosion of trust in institutions and elites that produced the political backlash of the 2010s. And the specific alignment between the interests of the American financial and corporate establishment and the internationalist vision that David Rockefeller advanced created over time a version of globalization that was more generous to capital than to labor, more comfortable with financial integration than with the development of the social protections that populations required to feel secure in a world of rapid economic change. David Rockefeller's personal legacy is inseparable from these broader achievements and failures, because he was so central to the construction of the specific form that American-led globalization took in the second half of the 20th century. He was not its sole architect. The forces that shaped the post-war international order were too complex and too various for any individual to claim that distinction, but he was one of the most consistent, most energetic, and most intellectually serious advocates for a specific vision of that order, and the institutions he built and sustained were among the most important vehicles through which that vision was translated into practical reality. Chase Manhattan Bank, whose international expansion he led across 24 years of chairmanship, was one of the pioneering institutions of American global banking, a bank that demonstrated the commercial viability of a genuinely international banking model and that shaped the development of the entire industry toward the global orientation that now characterizes the major American financial institutions. The bank itself was eventually absorbed. Chase merged with Chemical Bank in 1996, and the combined entity merged with J.P. Morgan in 2000 to create J.P. Morgan Chase, which is today the largest bank in the United States and one of the largest in the world. David Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan is now a constituent part of an institution of incomparably greater scale, but the international banking model that his tenure pioneered is one of the foundations on which that institution was built. The Trilateral Commission continues to operate, having evolved significantly from its 1970s form. It has expanded its geographic scope, added a Pacific Asian dimension to its original trilateral framework, and updated its policy agenda to address the challenges of the 21st century. Its membership continues to include senior figures from business, politics, academia, and civil society, its annual meetings continue to provide a forum for the exchange of views on major international challenges. Whether it continues to have the specific policy influence that it had during the Carter administration is a question that is difficult to assess from the outside, but it remains the most significant private forum for trilateral policy discussion. The Council on Foreign Relations, with which David was involved for most of his adult life, remains the central institution of the American foreign policy establishment, the organization through which the consensus views of the foreign policy community are developed, tested, and communicated. Its influence on American foreign policy is real and continuing, and David Rockefeller's long involvement with it was one of the more significant dimensions of his impact on the way American foreign policy is made. His philanthropic legacy, the continuation and expansion of the Rockefeller tradition of using private wealth in service of public purposes, includes contributions to the arts, to medical research, to conservation, and to education that are too numerous to catalogue comprehensively. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which he helped lead, continues to support work in areas ranging from democratic practice to sustainable development to peace building. The family's contributions to the cultural and intellectual life of New York City, through MoMA, through Rockefeller University, through the various other cultural and educational institutions that the family has supported, are part of the fabric of one of the world's great cities, David Rockefeller's Rolodex, the physical card file that he maintained with records of the more than 100,000 people he had met over his career, organized by country and by affiliation, has become, in the accounts of his life, a symbol of the specific kind of private power that he embodied. The power of personal relationship, cultivated systematically and maintained with extraordinary consistency as an instrument for the advancement of specific values and specific interests in the international arena. The Rolodex is a useful symbol not because it reveals anything sinister about David Rockefeller's activities. The maintenance of extensive personal relationships is a normal feature of the lives of people with wide professional networks, but because it captures something true about the specific nature of his influence. He was influential not primarily through the formal authority of his positions, chairman of Chase Manhattan, member of this board, director of that organization, but through the personal relationships that he cultivated with extraordinary care and consistency across more than 60 years of public life. These relationships gave him access and influence that the formal positions alone would not have provided, and they were themselves the product of a specific set of values, the belief in personal relationship building as a mechanism for advancing international cooperation. That was central to his worldview. He was, in the end, a man who genuinely believed that the world could be improved through the patient construction of institutional infrastructure and personal relationships, that the arc of history could be bent toward cooperation and away from conflict through the sustained effort of private individuals who used their resources, their relationships, and their time in service of that objective. This belief was, like most genuine beliefs about the improvement of the world, partly right and partly wrong. It was right about the importance of institutions, about the constructive potential of commercial engagement, about the value of personal relationships in maintaining communication across ideological and national divides. It was wrong, or at least incomplete, about the relationship between elite coordination and democratic legitimacy, about the degree to which the interests of the global establishment were aligned with the interests of the populations in whose name the international order was being constructed. The last grandchild of John D. Rockefeller is gone. The world he spent his life shaping has changed in ways he did not fully anticipate, ways that reveal both the achievements and the limitations of the internationalist vision that he embodied with more energy, more consistency, and more personal investment than almost anyone else of his remarkable generation. He was a banker who practiced diplomacy, a philanthropist who understood power, a private citizen who shaped public events, a man of genuine intellectual seriousness who operated in a world that often preferred instinct to analysis, a builder of institutions who lived long enough to see some of those institutions questioned in ways he had not expected. 101 years on this earth, and more than 60 of them spent in the serious service of a vision that was genuinely his own, flawed, partial, and real. That is the legacy of David Rockefeller, and it deserves to be understood in its full complexity, not as the secret master of a global conspiracy, and not as the selfless servant of humanity that the hagiographic accounts sometimes suggest, but as what he actually was, an extraordinarily privileged man who used his privilege with genuine seriousness and genuine purpose, in service of a vision of the world that was shaped by who he was, what he believed, and what class and time and place had made possible for him. The world he helped build is still with us. Its achievements and its failures are still unfolding. The judgment of history is still being written. So we have traced the full arc, from the Rockefeller family's origins in Standard Oil and the philosophy of responsible stewardship that John D. Rockefeller Jr. constructed in response to it, through David's education and his early years at Chase Manhattan, through the Soviet gambit and the China opening and the founding of the Trilateral Commission, through the Iranian crisis and its consequences, through the full range of the institutional and diplomatic activities that made David Rockefeller the most consequential private figure in American international affairs for the better part of 4 decades. The story is not a simple one. David Rockefeller was not a hero in the uncomplicated sense that the celebratory accounts of his life sometimes suggest. He was a man of genuine complexity, genuinely committed to the internationalist values that shaped his career, genuinely limited by the class and ideological perspective from which those values were developed, genuinely consequential in ways both constructive and problematic, and genuinely reflective about his own record in ways that distinguish him from the defensively self-justifying accounts that most powerful people offer of their own careers. The modern relevance of his story is not primarily about banking or about the Cold War. It is about the specific question that his career poses, with more clarity than almost any other life of the 20th century. What is the relationship between private power and public good? When is the exercise of private influence in international affairs legitimate and constructive? And when is it an unaccountable extension of private interests under the cover of public purpose? These questions have not been resolved. They are more pressing in the 21st century than they were in the 20th, as private wealth has become more concentrated, as the institutional infrastructure of global governance has become more complex and more contested, and as the democratic backlash against elite coordination has made the specific form of private diplomacy that David Rockefeller practiced simultaneously more suspect and more needed. The man with the 100,000 card Rolodex is gone. The questions his life posed remain. If this one made you think about private power, about the relationship between banking and foreign policy, about what the world's most influential private citizen of the 20th century actually did and what it meant, drop her in the comments. These stories about the people who shaped the architecture of the modern world, rather than simply the visible events of it, are among the most interesting and most research-intensive things I produce. David Rockefeller's own memoir, simply titled Memoirs and published in 2002, is the best single source on his career. It is unusually candid for the autobiography of a man of his prominence, and the passages where he reflects on the Iranian crisis and on his role in building what he calls a more integrated global structure are particularly revealing. The official biography by Michael Krenn, David Rockefeller, An Unfinished Legacy, provides more critical distance. If you found this depth useful, subscribing is how you make sure the next one reaches you. The natural follow-up to this video is our episode on Zbigniew Brzezinski, David Rockefeller's intellectual partner in the founding of the Trilateral Commission, and the man who, as National Security Advisor to Carter, translated the trilateral vision most directly into official policy. Brzezinski's story illuminates the specific relationship between private elite networks and official government policy that the Trilateral Commission represented, and his intellectual evolution, from the confident globalist of the 1970s to the more qualified and more worried analyst of his later years, is itself one of the most instructive journeys in 20th century American foreign policy thought. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching something that takes the full complexity of a consequential life seriously. See you in the next one.